Published work span colonial discourse on India, post-humanism, human rights and literature, and graphic novels. He is the second most published researcher in arts and humanities in India and South Asia, and seventh in South and Southeast Asia. In the recent years, he has focused on human rights, vulnerability, and precarious lives with a series of books and essays on the subject. Dr. Anna Kurian is a professor of English and currently the head of the department. Her areas of interest include Shakespeare, young adult literature, and children's literature. Dr. Kurian's work has contributed to the prestigious Encyclopedia of Children's Literature and Encyclopedia of Women and Islamic Cultures. Besides these, she also writes for The Wire and has developed numerous lessons for MMRC and the Open University. If you have any question during the talk, please drop them in the chat box. They will be addressed at the end. I thank both our speakers for joining us today and request them to start their talk. Hello.
Thank you, members of the Junior Science Club, for this innovative series of lectures that you have organized. And it's a pleasure, of course, as always, to be part of any panel with my colleague and dear friend, Anna, who agreed to this despite her obviously heavy schedule vis-a-vis her job as head of department. We'll begin with a couple of lines about Gurnah, biographical mainly. Born in Tanzania, then called Zanzibar, Gurnah arrived in the United Kingdom and was a student for several years at the University of Canterbury at Kent, and did his doctoral work with a very distinguished post-colonial critic, Professor C.L. Innes, who incidentally is a friend of the Department of English and has frequented us in the past. And while he has been a practicing academic for several decades now, Gurnah is known primarily as a novelist. Shortlisted twice for the Booker, for the Whitbread, and now the winner of the Nobel Prize. Gurnah's focus has been for a very long time on a rather complicated transition from colonial histories of Africa to the arrival of independent nations and their problems and politics, and finally to migrations, the creation of refugee cultures, as people moved out of many of these nations to other countries in the West, by which we mean primarily Europe, because to the best of my knowledge, Gurnah's work has been situated in and around Europe only. It's important to recognize that Gurnah's own biography, his life, has been that of an immigrant. And that is perhaps the experience that he has tried to portray with different degrees of effect and power in his novels. So while, like I said, he is a practicing academic, he has been known primarily as a novelist. The Department of English of the University of Hyderabad also has another connection with Gurnah. Gurnah supervised the work of Professor Syed Mujibuddin, who eventually came to the Department of English as faculty. So we have two connections, besides, of course, the fact that some of us have interacted with him before when in England. His novels, 10 in number, have been popular as literary fiction, not popular in the sense that they are bestsellers, but they have a large critical following. They have a fairly widespread academic presence in the form of critical work being done on them, PhD theses being written on them, as works that capture, which the Nobel citation that you just read out indicates, the fate of the immigrant and the fortunes of the refugee. So that's a little bit of biographical information. What we can find on Wikipedia and others, I don't want to repeat. Anna, would you like to chip in at this point, or do we move on?
So we were supposed to read the citation, the Nobel citation, but as you've done it, however, I think we will still repeat it once more, right? So the Nobel Prize in Literature 2021 was awarded to Abdulrazak Gurnah for his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents. Now, while it is easy enough to use that citation, what we thought you might like to think about also is the fact that much of his fiction reflects things that occurred in his own life. Of course, at one remove, I am not saying that it is autobiographical fiction in any way, but that Gurnah writes about things that he himself has known as a, if not a refugee, as an immigrant to England. And this is particularly true of the fact that when he first came to England, he was not a university student, he was not a university lecturer, but that he was a hospital orderly. From there, he moved on to becoming a student, then a university lecturer, and of course now a Nobel Prize winner. Earlier to that, a Booker shortlisted novelist. A couple of times, once Booker shortlist, once the Booker longlist. But you can see the trajectory yourself, that he moves from being somebody who begins at the lowest levels of society, if you will, in terms of class. He's a hospital orderly. And from there, he makes it step by step to, of course, this pinnacle of success that has come to him in October 2021 when he gets the Nobel Prize, right? And yet, so I was looking at a review in The Guardian, which said that his work mirrors the transformation in British attitudes to immigration. Now, whether or not that is true, what remains at the crux of his work is the idea of identity, cultural identity, where exactly you belong to, questions such as those. So he has, of course, written 10 novels, and over here you have only 8 of them. I will quickly go through the titles before we begin on common themes and things like that. So Gurnah has Admiring Silence, Afterlives, which is his most recent work, By the Sea, Dotty, Gravel Heart, Memory of Departure, Paradise, and this was the Booker shortlisted book, Pilgrim's Way, and The Last Gift. Now, one of the interesting things that when Pramod said that he is known primarily as a writer of literary fiction, one of the things you might like to think about is the fact that when he won the Nobel, people found it difficult to source his books. And this has been reported in newspapers and journalism coverage, but also in things like Goodreads, where they say that, how is it that we can't find his books? And suddenly his books are being reissued across the world. One of the reasons for that is also that some of his books are not published by mainstream publishers. They were published by small independent publishers who specialized in publishing works of literary fiction, which they thought might otherwise might not be published and might not get an audience. So this is how Gurnah's trajectory has been, from a very low-key individual in English/British society to now, of course, being the Nobel Prize winner. There are also several stats associated with him, that he is the first Black after Toni Morrison in 1993 to get the Nobel, that he is the first African after Kurtzi, I think, to get the Nobel, if I'm right. I might, of course, be wrong, and so on and so forth. However, those are things which are not really germane to this presentation, because here we are looking at the work of Abdulrazak Gurnah. I think now over to Pramod, who will do a brief mention of the principal themes in Gurnah, and then from there we'll move on to a kind of conversation about his novels. Pramod?
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Yes, it's interesting to see, if one is interested in biography as a framework within which to read literature, Gurnah's life and how it's reflected in this. It's not something some of us do any longer, but it used to be a fairly common practice some years ago. That said, to build on what Anna has offered up, there are 3 principal themes you can identify in Gurnah's works. It's also important that he's not as prolific or has had such a long career as Coetzee, the other big African Nobel laureate. Coetzee's fiction, but also his non-fictional prose are in large numbers, profusely studied and taught. Gurnah is, in that sense, also a little low-key in comparison with Coetzee. Well, like I said, we have identified three themes that might be of interest to some of you if you were to ever pick up Gurnah's text. First is the role of colonial history or imperial history in Africa and also in Europe. Colonial history as it impacts adversely the colonized, which is the Africans, but also the colonizer, which is the European. It needs to be emphasized that Gurnah's works are not about British imperialism in Africa alone, but includes Dutch and German ones. Because the eastern coast of Africa, from where Gurnah hails, and other parts were colonized by different European powers in the 19th century and all the way through the middle 20th. The German occupation, bits and pieces of Belgium, Congo, French occupation of here and there. The European continent had more or less spread its roots into Africa. So colonial history in Africa is not only English or British, it's a much larger dimension, which Gurnah's texts do talk about. And the obverse of it, how does this colonial history impact the Europeans who live there? So there are accounts of burghers, B-U-R-G-H-E-R, not the thing that we eat, but Europeans, European descendants in these places, settlers, their descendants in many parts of Africa, and how their lives are led. Some of you who are aware of Coetzee's work, this is also an abiding Coetzee obsession. The white folks who have stayed on in Africa, who have lived through apartheid and post-apartheid. Gurnah has similar interests. If you were to push that a little further in some of his novels, Gurnah will also be interested in how colonial history has affected England and the English, how their sense of who they once were. The British Empire is the largest empire human history has ever seen, and many English remain entrenched in the past, nostalgic about it. And this history of colonialism, of imperialism, and its racial dynamics remain sedimented in English psyches. This is also a big theme. So it's not only the impact of colonialism on the African that Gurnah is interested in, he's also interested in the impact of colonialism on the British psyche. The next major theme is immigration and the migrant experience. As Anna pointed out, Gurnah arrived in England well before what is now called immigration or migration studies. An early generation transplanted African, battling obviously different forms of racial discrimination, and some of which gets into his novels. So immigration and the migrant experience is central to a couple of his novels. And finally, the refugee. We need to understand that the immigrant and the refugee are not interchangeable always. And the refugee crisis in the recent past has brought back into literary sensibilities and cultural analysis the conditions in and through which the refugees are formed. And the Nobel citation of Gurnah focuses primarily on his interest in and portrayal of refugees. So three principal themes: colonial history about Africa and its impact on Africa and as well as on Europe, immigration and the migrant experience, and refugeedom. 3 themes in Gurnah's novels, 10 of them. We can now move on to talking about these themes in a little more detail by way of a conversation between Anna and myself, dividing the novels up, so to speak. I'll start with, and this is a roughly historical chronological sequence. We'll start with colonial history, which is most effectively portrayed in Afterlives, Gurnah's latest novel. It is set somewhere in the late 1880s in the eastern coast of Africa, and during the time of the Abushiri revolt. And this is an interesting novel for what it tries to do. It speaks about the European battle for Africa, because the German, the British, the French, the Belgians, they are all fighting for a little slice of the African pie. So Gurnah here is explicitly referring to the formation of contemporary Africa as a result of an extremely violent colonial process, where the Europeans wished to divide up the land for their own benefit, divide up the resources those lands contained, and what happened to those particular places. So Afterlives is about this very long drawn-out war between the Germans and the British, somewhere from the late 1880s to 1910, 1915 or so, and that is the expanse of the temporal expanse of the novel. So Africans who are forced to join German or British forces, they're becoming interred as prisoners of war, the torture, the intra-tribal rivalry in the army, where people from different African tribes, when they join the army, how do they work? So Elias, Hamza are the other characters in the novel who battle not only racial prejudice by the Germans and from the British, they also face ethnic tensions among themselves, where different tribes of the African region are mostly at odds with each other. So there are accounts where there is a very explicit statement about how Germans in the army made use of the Africans, but treated them badly. So when they set up camp, the Germans slept in tents under mosquito nets. The Germans had better food. The Africans who were in the army were treated badly. For those of you who are aware of history, this is precisely also the story of the Indians who served in the British Army during the World Wars. There is also another angle to colonial and post-colonial history here, where there are several Indians who have been taken or who arrived in these nations, bought agricultural land, became landlords, or owned businesses. And in Afterlives, Gurnah speaks about how the Indians who became British citizens had a monopoly over all businesses and commerce. And this is what would be very interesting for some of you, the Indians who were also migrants to Africa had taken over the businesses, like I just said, and treated the Africans badly. So this is the fate of a country, of a region, of a people who have been repeatedly colonized. Their loyalties have been divided. Their ethnic identities have been forced into conflict. I'm not saying that it was the British who generated the conflict. Conflicts among tribals and tribal groups have always been part of African history, as we now know. And of course, the tension between Indians who prove themselves to be as racist as the Europeans when it comes to dealing with the Africans themselves. So that is Afterlives, arguably his most powerful indictment of colonialism, where he describes, like I said, the violence and the racism against the African members of the army and the locals who were exterminated. It speaks about resistance, the Maji Maji uprising of the early 1900s, and of course, the millions of Africans who died from starvation. My last point about this particular history, which he talks about, is that in this particular novel, there is an emphasis also on the great colonial theme of the civilizational mission. So the German missionary who aids the Africans, who aids the Germans, he aids everybody, he helps everyone compassionately, is generous, compassionate, caring, irrespective of who comes to him. And it is one of those high points of the novel where, despite the tension of operating in a war zone, the German missionary and the mission compound becomes the source of hope, a kind of place of amenity and service, irrespective of who turns up injured. Over to you, Anna. You're on mute.
Right, sorry. So if Afterlives is about how the Europeans fought for Africa and the wars amongst European nations to possess parts of Africa, in several of these books, Gurnah also writes about how lives were with German, or with when the areas were under European occupation, when they were colonies, so to speak. What is interesting about it is also that even as he gives us the vast sweep of history and what is happening across the continent, so to say, he is also giving us the everyday, minute details of lives, small lives, lived simply, lived in poverty, lived in squalor, lived in maybe not so much poverty or squalor, lived in comparative prosperity. So you see lives not just in the colonies as they were when they were being, say, oppressed and downtrodden, but also people who flourished during those times, flourished because of their nexus with the colonizers, flourished due to whatever reason. So when we read, say, a book such as either By the Sea or The Last Gift, you have these sections of the books which are devoted to life in what was then called Zanzibar, still under European colonialism, still with white masters, and the ways in which people related to each other and related to their white masters. He also positions it interestingly because at that point he also shows, he doesn't show us, at least in By the Sea or The Last Gift, he doesn't show us the efforts which lead to independence, but he shows the takeover. And once the takeover happens, how the colony, the once upon a time colony of the Europeans, how it then deteriorates into anarchy, confusion, violence, and how that leads to both immigration as well as to people seeking refugee status in European nations. So it is not that Gurnah is giving us this one-sided view of history, and that's something which is particularly useful to think about, especially in today's world where we are all more or less conditioned to think about things in very unnuanced ways or non-nuanced ways, when we are taught that there is only one version of history which is acceptable. Gurnah gives us, as Pramod said about Afterlives, you have the missionary whose work is not, we may not find it laudable, the conversions and the evangelical things that he does. But the fact that he is compassionate, irrespective of who is the recipient of that compassion, makes a small point. Similarly, when we read texts such as By the Sea or The Last Gift, what we are being shown is that the enmity amongst the people of Zanzibar is not necessarily a bequest by their white masters, but that it is something which is inherent to them. They're just like everybody else. They squabble, they fight, they are mean, they are nasty, and that there is no particular virtue in being African. And that, like I said, is a corrective to the discourse that we have today, where just by virtue of belonging to a nation, we are seen as more virtuous, more perfect in our many good qualities. That's not something which Gurnah is buying into. So it's a very nuanced portrayal of the African, their society, their culture. And in particular, where if you were to read By the Sea, he focuses on the very mean, very nasty, in fact, moving from meanness, pettiness, and nastiness to outright violence and cruelty, which is inflicted by Black men and women upon other Black men and women. So it's both individual as well as cultural that he's talking about. That it's not just about how I am this way, but that my world is also this way. We are the way we are. And that's something which he takes over. So when we are looking at the nature of the post-colony, in several of these books, and Pramod will speak, I think, a little bit about another of these, Memory of Departure. But I was thinking about By the Sea, wherein you have a very detailed portrayal of the post-colony. It has just been set free. The colonial masters have departed to their own homes. And yet, it is not an occasion for rejoicing, but rather an occasion for mourning, because the entire world dissolves into absolute chaos, absolute anarchy. And in that world of anarchy and chaos and violence, it becomes imperative to escape, not just from the people around you, the neighborhood in which you live, but from the country itself, if you are to have a life. And in that sense, then it moves into the other significant themes, which would be immigration and refugeedom, which was the ones which were spoken about in the Nobel Prize citation as well. Pramod?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, actually, you stopped exactly at the point at which the other theme begins, that is the nature of the post-colony. And as most of you would have observed, both Anna and I spoke about the intra-ethnic, intra-tribal tensions that have driven African polity, African politics, its sense of national, regional, local identities, in a text which is not really an immigration text, because it's only at the very end of the novel that the main character, Hassan Omar, leaves for Singapore. So he's not at that point an immigrant, but I will come to that in a minute. And I'm speaking here of Memory of Departure, which is primarily about growing up in an African nation. It's unnamed. Briefly, he escapes to Nairobi, comes back. The war in Nigeria is part of the setting, and it ends with him going out on a ship to Singapore. Memory of Departure is about, like I said, living in an African nation, and it has all the characteristics of any community. Hassan Omar has family troubles. His brother and he are subject to violence from his father, who is abusive. There is violence on the streets. There is violence in the home. There is a strong religious sentimentality that informs practically all families in Africa. There is rape. There is violence and murder. There is the militancy, of course. Then there is the racial sorting for jobs, the tensions between different ethnic types. There is also the influence of Western culture. I mean, there is a particularly fine scene where Hassan Omar is looking at the My Fair Lady posters, film posters, and what Western culture means to him. There is immense poverty. There's immense competition for food, competition for employment, and a competition for peace, because Gurnah is a very unrelenting portrait of an African nation. It is not oh, the British have left, how wonderful it is to be free, as Anna said. No, the question is, what is the post-colony now? As the philosopher Achille Mbembe said, the post-colony is characterized by a necropolitics, necro meaning death. It's a production of death, mass production of death. And it's not, as Anna said, a bequest, a legacy of the colonial era or colonial rule. It is what the Africans have for themselves. So the violence that is endemic to Africa is something Gurnah portrays with a very brutal, with a very honest eye. There is also the sense of a renewed African nationalism. And Gurnah is very skeptical about a post-colony or a post-colonial nation suddenly asserting their own national identity, their cultural nationalisms. There is a particular passage very early in the novel where Omar, on the train to Nairobi, meets an African Nairobi University student who is very mocking about the whole idea of cultural nationalism and national identity. He says, oh, now all the time we talk about African art and African literature and African history and African culture and all that rubbish. And he says, and this is where Gurnah's criticism comes in, we can't even make a screwdriver or a tin of talcum powder for ourselves. It's technology we need. Everything we use now, everything we buy now comes from Europe or of America, and they talk of African tradition. It is an unusual passage because in the post-colony, very few writers dare to question the nature of national identity. We all find many of these writers easily shifting the blame onto the colonials, that it's because of the colonial domination that we are unable to do anything for ourselves, but we are all full of very rich, very powerful traditions of our own. And this guy, his name is Moses, is telling Hassan Omar, what rubbish, African art, African literature, we cannot even make a screwdriver or even a tin of talcum powder. Everything we have now, everything we use now comes from Europe or from America. And we have neither the technology nor the money to get these. Even the money comes from them. Even the technology comes from them. So I just don't understand what we are talking about as African art. This is a huge, huge argument because it reflects upon the kind of jingoism about national identity that the post-colonies have without any real economic foundation. So it is a criticism of national identity, of nationalist rhetoric, which really has no substance behind it. Anna, do you want to speak about any other novel now? That was Memory of Departure.
Yeah, so I want to also talk about, in the post-colony, a little bit more about By the Sea, which is, of the ones which I have read, the only one which deals at considerable length with the idea of how the post-colony is. And I'm sorry, I'm keeping my video off because then it just is wavering. So we'll go with just my voice for the time being, if that's all right. So yeah, so in By the Sea, you have this sustained portrayal of the world of the Africans in Zanzibar. The white masters have gone back, and there is this government which they show, or which Gurnah shows us, which is primarily a government of vengeance, vendetta, pettiness, cruelty for the sake of cruelty. They enjoy the feeling of power they have, and so they put people away in prison. They turn them into prisoners, not necessarily of war or of conscience, just prisoners. They send them away to be incarcerated, solitary confinement, penned onto an island. There are, of course, various cruelties visited upon them in these conditions. And those cruelties are never ending, because as long as the government lasts, as long as their enemies are in power, those cruelties continue. And the next set of people who come into the government, they just switch their targets. It is not that the mode of governance changes. It is only that the targets change, because then the new people who are in power. They are interested in settling their grievances. They are interested in making the most of the power that they enjoy. So also then interested in snatching away other people's property, taking their lives, taking their families, breaking them up, killing people, and so on and so forth. It's a horrifying portrayal of the world of the post-colony. And also because Gurnah does not seem to say that there is much hope in remaining there, staying on there, because at the end, or rather the whole of By the Sea is a story which is shown in flashback about how the person who is suffering this has to eventually leave if he is to live. There is no life for him which is possible in Zanzibar. Once the whites had vanished, had gone away, once they have achieved freedom, once they are part of Tanzania, then the only way for the characters, the black characters in this novel, the only way for them to survive is if they are to leave and go away as immigrants / as refugees to those very European nations which once upon a time oppressed them and colonized them. So the post-colony as portrayed by Gurnah is really not in any way idyllic. There is absolutely nothing going for it. There might be brief instances of joy, but those are also very precarious lives. And as Pramod knows, precarity is also something which, one of the definitions which I've heard used by him, of course, is that you look at somebody and you know that that might be me in the very next minute. There, but for the grace of God, go I kind of thing. And that is what a lot of the main characters in By the Sea seem to know, that only one fine line separates them from those who are suffering torment at this point in time. So the post-colony. And from now, I think we're moving into immigration and refugee, Pramod? Is that next step?
Yes.
Okay, so you want to go first?
Right. Anna's brought it up to the point where, building on what each other has said, we spoke about the nature of the independent nation, as in the nature of African countries who have acquired independence from their European masters. And life in the post-colony, which begins with this huge jingoistic sense that, oh, we are powerful, we have become independent, we are nationalist, etc., etc. Then Gurnah's focus is not on the national pride of such a place, not on the cultural nationalism of such a place, but rather on the violence which is endemic to all these societies. And as a result, as Anna said, the only way you can escape it is by leaving. You migrate out of Africa because there is no hope within an African nation. It's a very gloomy, dystopian view of the post-colony, that nothing will come out of it. And again, not because this is what the British or the French have left us, because that is the way we are. This is who we are. It's what we do that defines us. And what we do is pillage and murder and torture and rape. And there is nothing else in Africa. One such character who leaves an African nation, which is horrible to live in, is the hero of Pilgrim's Way, a novel primarily about immigration, and it is set somewhere in London in the mid-1970s. And Daud, the hero of the tale, is an interesting and complicated figure. He has friends who are, like him, extremely angry about the British. And it's full of imaginary conversations or letters Daud writes to the British, where he blames every Britisher he meets or doesn't meet for the indignity he has suffered. So he will refer to the British as the gifted killer race which went around the world, that they are duplicitous. He blames the British, but he also encounters racial abuse. He is romantically involved with an English woman, Catherine. He cannot understand her promiscuity. And he also admits that nothing surprises me, he says, about the racist confusions of the European. So there are two or three things about Pilgrim's Way. Pilgrim's Way, I don't know whether you know the historical location of Pilgrim's Way, but it's also part of the region in which Gurnah taught for a long time. Canterbury is the site of a Pilgrim's Way. It's also the site of the earliest celebrated poet in the English canon, Geoffrey Chaucer, who describes this place. The Underground Railway station and its ducts, the subways, have images painted from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales about the Pilgrim's Tale. And that is a kind of resonating background to Daud, who says several times he is not a pilgrim. And the one place he has never gone to visit is the church next to him, the cathedral next to him, till Catherine, his girlfriend, takes him there. Now, the immigrant faces considerable, consistent racial abuse. This is relentless pressure, the mockery, the abuse. Whenever he's walking past a group of white men, the skinheads, as they are called in the novel and outside it, mock him. When he's out with his girlfriend, there are people who make extremely horrific, sexually loaded remarks at him and her. He's beaten on a couple of occasions. He faces racism within the hospital. He's a floor cleaner in the hospital in London, and he's mocked all the time. Some are kind to him, but when they are kind to him, and this is my second point, when they're kind to him, he doesn't appreciate it. When they are angry and racist towards him, he doesn't like it either. So he does not like their pity, their sympathy, or their empathy. He does not appreciate their willingness to help him. So there's this white man who comes in, brings him food, spends time with him, and all the time Daud is shouting at him for being nice to him. And he's always pondering upon this situation where the white man is helping him, perhaps because of a sense of guilt for his racial history, his racist history, more accurately. So the immigrant is troubled, is confused. He believes he is being treated badly by the whites, which is true, but he also doesn't like being treated nicely by the whites. And that is what he refers to as the racist confusions of the European mind. They do not know what to do any longer. There are a couple of other things here where he says the Arabs and the Indians now own all the land in Africa. This is after independence. The Arabs and the Indians own all the land in Africa, and the blacks, that is the natives, the Africans, are laborers. So slavery continues in another form, but this time instead of the white master, it's the brown-skinned master. So the Europeans have gone and the Arabs and Indians have taken over. There is a longish criticism of the post-colony and the African nations where he speaks about their so-called democracies, African democracies, which is primarily authoritarian and allows dictatorships to flourish. And as he says, I cannot think of a single good thing in defense of the socialist one-party democracies. There's absolutely nothing here. So in this particular case, there is a reverse stereotyping of the Brits, like I said. He's unable to determine whether he likes the British for being nice to him or he hates them for being nice to him. He, of course, despises them for being racist in the past. He's uncertain as to where his own attitudes towards the British lie. Should he like them? Should he not? He's very clear that his African nation from where he came is no longer quote-unquote democracy as we understand it, because whatever passes for democracy is actually authoritarianism. And as he says, it gives the socialist party to take away all human rights. So the immigrant here is a divided soul, like the post-colony is a divided nation. And the European is also a divided soul. That was Pilgrim's Way, set in the mid 1970s. Over to Anna now, if she wants to continue on the immigration theme.
Yeah, I want to say a little bit about immigration, but also in connection with the refugee theme, because in By the Sea you have the refugees, and in The Last Gift you have the migrant experience. Also, I read another one which was just called Dottie, the novel, and in that, interestingly, it's neither a migrant nor a refugee. It is somebody who has been British for 3 generations, or rather, who is the product of grandparents who were once migrants, but she is no longer a migrant. So what we have in Gurnah, actually, when we were tracing that historical progression that Pramod spoke about in the beginning, we are looking at novels, at fiction that he has written, which traces colonialism. Oh, no, actually from before the beginnings of colonialism, when the different European nations are fighting over who will colonize which part of Africa. Moving from there through to active colonialism, through to the post-colony, to immigration, to the refugees, and finally to just being a Black in England. So if you can see that progression is very interesting, because I don't know very many authors who do that kind of progression. They might focus on one stage, and my example would be somebody like say Ajibe, who's talking about life in Africa, right? But instead over here, what you have is fiction which shows us the entire process, and also then shows us how you cannot really isolate any one of these, but that race remains a constant problem, issue, whatever you want to call it, but that race is that central crux for all of these books. It's a fascinating idea that Gurnah is working with when he speaks about in The Last Gift. So in The Last Gift, you have a couple, oldish couple, and Abbas and Mariam. Abbas is the migrant who came once again from Zanzibar, and in the process never again looked back, as in he does not speak about where he came from, what his family was like there, what his life was like there. There is nothing. It is as if he began from the moment that he arrived in England. And that leads me to a theme which is not precisely linked to this historical progression that we've been talking about, Pramod and I, but to the theme of storytelling, which is constantly underlined and evoked by Gurnah in his fiction, about the stories people tell. So storytelling also connected, of course, to memories, and the memories that create immigrants, their personality. Like Pramod said, the guy in Pilgrim's Way, he is unhappy, he is conflicted, he is unable to deal with either white people who are nice to him or white people who are brutal to him. Similarly, how is it that you look back at a past and are unable to see where you yourself were once situated? And in the book, The Last Gift, you have Abbas and Mariam who refuse to look back, because to look back is to jeopardize the very precarious sense of self that they have in their present life. That the past, whatever it might have been, and through much of the book, we are exploring that past. As they've grown old, as one of them, Abbas has a stroke, as he is bedridden, and as finally he then goes back into the past, what we are being told also is about how that past, which he was so afraid of because he thought it would threaten the little life that he had made for himself as a migrant in England, that life would be shattered, would come apart if he was to remember the past that he once had in Zanzibar. So the past and the present coming together in migrant lives is something which, again, he revisits. And it happens, of course, also in By the Sea, where it's also the one book which I have read of Gurnah's which is most concerned with the refugee experience. In fact, it begins right at the beginning. You have this part where he speaks about how he came as a refugee, and it begins with that, like 2 pages into the fiction, into the novel, you have him saying refugee, asylum. The narrator of the novel, says refugee and he says asylum. And the whole book is about how he needs asylum because he is a refugee and because he has come away from Zanzibar with nothing and is seeking asylum in England. Now, all of these characters in all of these books that we're talking about, all of them are also, like Pramod said, troubled by the fact that they don't quite fit in. And like I said, race being central, that when they look at the whites around them, they find that they are different, that they are seen differently, and they are not able to deal with it. So in By the Sea, you have this phrase which I found fascinating, where he called two white people who are helping him, the refugee who has come, Mr. Shaban, who are helping him to stay on in England. He calls them refugee redeemers. And it is, of course, ironic that they see themselves as redeeming a black man, helping him. And he calls him, he says, Rachel and Jeff, those are the names of the white people. They were too busy with the heady battles they were fighting within their secure citadels. And that, of course, brings you to the juxtaposition that he is making between the security that the white person enjoys in Britain as opposed to the precarious, vulnerable lives that the black refugee or the black migrant has in the same country, in the same city, the same town, even if he does get asylum. And there is also, in all of these books, the constant iteration of the fact that you become the subject of other people's stories. That your own story, can you tell your own story, or is somebody else telling your story for you? So even as the refugee in By the Sea tries to tell his own story, he also knows that other people are telling his story for him. Would you like to say something, Pramod?
Now, I want to move from here. If you have finished with this, two things we have to do. One is about the nature of his writing and the context in which we read these novels. Going to the context, and perhaps the context for the Nobel Prize also, much of Gurnah's work ought to be read in the context of events, processes like Black Lives Matter, the refugee crisis of the few years recently, the opposition to the canonization, I use the term in a literary sense, of authors like Toni Morrison, which is now rampaging through the Western world as why we should read Toni Morrison. Texts like Gurnah's are important because, as Anna said, we can't tell all our own stories. Sometimes we tell others' stories, others tell our stories. It's not always possible for us to capture every known aspect of a country's history. We have not lived there. We have not experienced all of it. I mean, when we say, for instance, India's history, how much of India do we know? How much of our region, our locality, does any one of us know for us to be able to say that I can write the history of a particular place? All our individual experiences are limited. And consequently, all our vision, our writing of the narrative will be limited. So if you were to read Gurnah alongside, say, colonial history or the history of the post-colony, then you get a broader picture. Now, I'm not getting into a debate whether Gurnah's portrayal or depiction of Africa or England is authentic or not. Authenticity is an effect of the writing. It is not necessarily innate to anything. And the authenticity debate can be carried far enough to ask how authentic are we when we have to say any of these things. But it's an effect of the literature and the literary writing. So I would say that reading Gurnah requires us to contextualize it in not only colonial history and its legacies, but also contexts such as the present, where we see it within, say, Black Lives Matter as a movement, the troubles, opposition to and antagonism towards texts and authors such as Toni Morrison, also a Nobel laureate, towards things and movements such as multiculturalism, in which the question of the refugee, the question of the immigrant has more or less remained unchanged in terms of the racial dynamics. So that is the context in which we want to read. Does Anna, do you want to add anything to this?
Not particularly to the context, except that the context, especially of Black Lives Matter, would be one. I mean, let me make this anecdotal. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, this is not entirely an academic exercise. So I think the anecdote works. When Gurnah won the Nobel, we asked ourselves and we asked a couple of others whether any of them had read Gurnah in the department, and everybody said no. And Pramod, I think, was the only one who said he's read a couple, and that was very long ago when he met Gurnah. But then, of course, we read him, and then we still couldn't figure out why exactly he got the Nobel, because both of us agreed that his work, while it has a plot, while it has substance, and while it has many of the characteristics of literary fiction, is not really as gripping as, say, Ishiguro, who won the Nobel 2 years ago, a year ago, right? So Ishiguro, who writes a compelling story and who seems to explore far more interesting ideas, seems to be not quite the way I should be putting it, but who explores many diverse ideas, let us say. Whereas Gurnah's canvas, for all that we have said, he does this historical progression of colonialism and after, is still a very limited canvas that he's using. So we were asking this question, and one of the answers that we got to this question was that the reason Gurnah wins the Nobel now is because of Black Lives Matter. That there is a certain audience now for a certain kind of fiction, for a certain kind of writer. Now, I do not mean to be, I'm not trying in any way to denigrate Gurnah's work. I have found it fascinating. I have read it with some enjoyment over the last few weeks. And it is interesting, instructive. It also gives you complexity and depth. And yet, why is it that at this moment in time, and especially when you think about the fact that a text like Afterlives didn't really even feature in the review pages of any of our newspapers, doesn't really feature anywhere for that matter, why would he be the winner for the Nobel this year? And the answer will be that the contexts favor the winning of the Nobel by Gurnah. That when we are looking at a world which is divided over refugees, and if you think about refugees now, we are not thinking only in terms, actually we are hardly thinking in terms of just the Africans who are coming, say, to the European nations. We are thinking about refugees at every border, right? So we are thinking about the Rohingyas, we are thinking about the Mexican border with America, we are thinking about Poland currently, Poland and Belarus and their borders, right? We are looking at a whole range of borders which are rife with refugees trying to get in, whether it is along the river Rio Grande or whether it is at that in those freezing forests of Poland where they are just sitting there quietly trying to get across into Poland and into Europe, whether it is the Rohingyas here in Hyderabad itself or whether as they try to come into Bengal, West Bengal, the other side, right? Whether they are coming in here, we are looking at the refugee as a very real problem. And what Gurnah points to is the refugee as he is made, as he's created by a certain set of forces, in Gurnah's books, The Postcolony, but also the refugee who has no other option other than to leave. And for this, I want to read one quotation from, again, By the Sea, because in that he has this line wherein he's just arrived in England and he's, like I said, asking for refugee status. And at that point, the guy at the airport where he's just disembarked, he says, "How much danger is your life really in? Do you realize what you're doing? Whoever persuaded you to do this is not doing you any favors, let me tell you that." And then he proceeds, and I quote, "You don't even speak the language. You probably never will. It is very rare for old people to learn a new language. Do you know that? No one will give you a job. You'll be lonely and miserable and poor. And when you fall ill, there'll be no one here to look after you. Why didn't you stay in your own country where you could grow old in peace? This is a young man's game, this asylum business. Because it is really just looking for jobs and prosperity in Europe and all that, isn't it? There is nothing moral in it, just greed. No fear of life and safety, just greed." And I found that terribly sad, but also really ironic, because the person saying it is sitting securely in his own country. He's got everything going for him. He's looking at an old man across the desk who's asked for refugee status, who's asked for asylum. And he says, "You're here for jobs. Do we even understand why the refugee is knocking at our gates? If we were to read Gurnah, maybe we would." Pramod.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that was an amazing contextualization. I would also concur with much of what Anna said and add a couple of examples. The Syrians trying to cross a couple of years ago, and how you become refugees in your own country. People sitting on top of aeroplanes as they take off and falling to the earth. Afghanistan in the most recent memories. Also, the conditions under which refugees are made. Refugees are constructed through certain political conditions. In order to live, you need environments that sustain life. When those environments erode or corrode, how does life go on? That's the kind of larger question. And how does Gurnah do this? Which brings us to the final point that Anna and I have, and that is to do with the nature of his writing. Unlike most African authors who dabble in what literary scholars, I do not know whether many of you are aware of this, a kind of writing called magical realism, which mixes up reality with dreams and nightmares, which have characters of the human kind and characters of the divine kind working together. So it's difficult to understand where the reality ends and the dream begins. It's a bit of everything. Gurnah doesn't do that. Gurnah writes sparse, minimalist prose, more or less gritty realism. As Anna said, sad, yes. All his novels are primarily sad novels. They are gripping in their own way, but they don't try to do too much complexity. In many, many novels, Gurnah is interested in how people grow up. And there's a particular genre in literature which deals with the growing up of human beings, and it's called the Bildungsroman. I won't repeat the term because it will just hurt people who are not from literature to hear that. But Gurnah is interested in how people grow up. For example, in his early novels, boys are beaten brutally. Girls are also beaten brutally by their fathers. There is gender equality of a horrific kind here. Their hands are broken, their eyes are pulverized, their noses disarranged. Boys are frequently raped. Girls are sold, forced into marriages. There's very little food. And the growth of that boy, and it's principally around male characters that Gurnah situates his novels, the growth of that character into an adult is the subject of several of his tales. The growing up as I mentioned in a slightly different context a few minutes ago, requires a sustaining environment. What happens when the environment doesn't enable your growth? What happens when the environment, the world you live in, is inimical to your growth? How do you grow when all the factors that are necessary for your cognitive, intellectual, emotional, and physical biological growth are missing from your life? There is not adequate food. There is no emotional support. There is no education worth talking about. In Memory of Departure, for instance, when he says he doesn't want to go to pray, and when he doesn't want to go to a religious instruction, but instead he would rather go to a different kind of school. He's beaten by his father, and his mother is in tears that her son no longer wants religious instruction. He wants a different kind of instruction. He wants to go to the university, and he wants to study other things. But the pressure to conform to family structures, family belief systems, and practices is so high that he doesn't know what to do. So growing up in the African community is not easy. The answer, and why, as I just outlined, this situation is inimical. So boys growing up, several people don't. That's the answer. Because many people don't make it to adulthood. In the violent lives in their communities, many people don't reach adulthood. Gurnah is, like I said, an unveiling of certain horrors of that society. And he does this with, like I said, a very minimalist, sparse kind of prose. He is not into very nuanced kind of writing, as Anna said, in comparison with someone like Kazuo Ishiguro, who is by far a more accomplished, I think, novelist. I think it's bad to say that comparing to Nobel laureates, but yes. Gurnah prefers to write in a way that appeals to most people without too much of lingering on detail that bogs you down. He doesn't want to complicate your interpretation by introducing many characters. In fact, the one novel with that kind of expanse of characters is Afterlives, because it spans over an 80-100 year period. So by necessity, there are far more characters than in other novels. But there are fewer characters. It's gritty in its realism, and it is there. It is meant to communicate through both showing and telling. There aren't too many metaphors, very distinctive turns of phrase. It's just a straight narrative. Over to Anna if she wants to add anything.
Yeah. So the Bildungsroman, yes, but we are used to thinking in terms of the novel of growing up as something which ends when the character is in his 20s. What Gurnah does with the novel of growing up is, however, to show that sometimes people don't grow up fully until maybe they are in their 60s. He also gives us these portrayals, and this would be, my illustration would be from the novel Dottie, because Dottie is, like I said, the one novel which I read, which was set only, I mean, there is no Africa in it. There are bits and pieces of small stories which are linked to very peripheral characters who might have come from Africa. But other than that, there is nothing very much which is to do with Africa. It is to do with a Black family living in England, and it's primarily to do with three small children, Dottie and her sister Sophia and her brother Hudson. They are the children of a prostitute, and how the prostitute, their mother dies, and Dottie brings up the other two. The novel actually begins when she's in her early teens, ends when she's in her mid-20s, but it is the classic version of the novel of growing up. However, if you were to look at, say, a novel such as The Last Gift, where the person who is Abbas, who is the main character, who has a series of strokes, the book begins with him having a stroke and it ends with him dying after a stroke. It begins with his wife picking him up when he's had a stroke, and it ends with her, she's in her 50s, she's leaving the country, going to look for her parents. The growing up arc is something that does not stop when you have achieved integration. at the age in your 20s into the society in which you live in. And what Gurnah does is demonstrate that sometimes you may never achieve this kind of perfect integration into the society in which you live, but that as you grow older, you become more comfortable in your skin. And isn't that what growing up means? That finally you are able to look at yourself and you're fine with who you are and what you are. At that point, you've grown up. Or at least that's what I took away from books such as Doughty and Last Gift and By the Sea, and I think Pramod also from the books that he read of Gurnah's. So he uses gritty realism. Actually, the gritty realism is, in some ways, reading his books is a bleak enterprise. There is very little happiness happening there. There is a lot of misery, and sometimes the Pramod says there's a lot of violence and so on and so forth. The ones which I read, the violence is an undertone, which doesn't really come up front and center. Instead, it's there, it's happening, but he's not dwelling on it. So you're not really seeing it in graphic detail. There's violence. So in Doughty, the mother, who is a prostitute, has a really hard time. And these 3 small children being kicked around, all of it is there, but you're not being given gruesome details. Likewise in the other books as well. So it is realism. The grittiness actually comes from an evocation of England. It's always grey. It's always dull. It's always miserable. There isn't too much food. There isn't sunshine and cheer and happiness. Instead, everybody is uniformly miserable. So in that sense, the realist mode works very well for Abdulrazak Gurnah. And I would think that one more of those forms, if you were to think in terms of realism and the Bildungsroman, the third one I would think would be the historical realist novel, because he is very invested in ideas of history. But again, it's not with the nitty-gritty of dates and specifics of what happened on which date. Instead, it is with the ideas which underpin history, ideas about colonialism, about the whole, what's the word I'm looking for, Pramod, where the white man goes out as the savior.
The white man's burden.
The white man's burden. So it is those ideas, again, historical, but a different version of history, in the sense that he's not interested in telling us in 1948 this happened, and then this happened, and then 1962 this happened. Those dates slip in and out, but the concepts that underpin history are the ones that he's working with. So in that sense, again, it's form, at the same time, it's slightly tangential. It's fascinating. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of the form of writing that Gurnah does. I agree fully with what Anna is saying about the evocative nature of the prose. It's there as an undercurrent, not necessarily put out there, not necessarily explicated in great detail. It's not that level of realism that you find in, say, Rohint and Mistry, but it's there as an undercurrent, and you sense the violence in many cases. I think that's about as much as we wanted to say. I think we have covered the ground that we promised to do, starting with the introduction through the themes and something about the form. So we will now, and unless Anna has anything to add, hand it back to the MCs for the evening, the Junior Science Club. Anna, is there anything?
No, I think we're done.
Right, yeah. So let's hand it back to the Junior Science Club. Thank you.
Thank you, sir and ma'am. That was a wonderful talk. We especially enjoyed the mode of conversation through the talk. And now we'll address the questions which are asked by the audience. You can post the questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourselves and ask the questions. Thank you.
Roy Matthew has a question, but before that, there was Shankar Ilangavan in the chat box. How can his writing be considered very authentic when he has not lived in Africa for over 50 years now? I think Pramod kind of answered that when he spoke about authenticity, but if Pramod wants to...
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Does it mean that if you have lived in a place for 100 years, you are more connected to it? You can remain as ignorant of that place after living there for 50 years, the idea of a novelist is to be able to recreate from memory and to be able to imagine another's suffering. So I think the question of authenticity, like I said, is a question of the way in which authenticity is delivered. Who did you say had his hand raised?
Roy Matthew has his hand.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, so much for. Thank you, Anna ma'am and Pramod sir, so much for the lecture. One thing I couldn't help but wondering about was why the narrator would be disturbed when the white men treat him with kindness. So could it be because of a hangover from the white man's burden? Because whenever white men decide to be kind to people, it doesn't usually end up well, as history has shown repeatedly.
It is because the character believes that, oh, you are continuing your civilizational mission and treating us like barbarians who need a helping hand, but also because he's resentful of remaining at the receiving end of kindness and charity. So despite the fact that he has arrived in quote unquote the first world, the global north, he still remains impoverished, not very well off, hungry, and he requires help from the white man. Like I said, at the beginning, he has a chip on the shoulder, on his shoulders about it, and he objects to that. And he says, "Oh, you're trying to just the term that Anna used. Oh, you're a refugee redeemer. You're just trying to cleanse yourself of your past sins, or rather the sins of your predecessors. You may not have directly been responsible for my country's colonization." So yes, you are right about that, Roy.
Pratyaksh Mohan has put up a question. Our country was also under slavery. It is much more diverse, but we live in harmony. But in Africa, though they look alike, they discriminate amongst themselves. Are Indians more mature?
I think that's an arguable point.
I would also agree that it's an arguable point, Pratyaksh or Mohan, whichever. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm getting your first name wrong, but are we really living in harmony? And I would argue about that. I don't.
Are we more mature?
Are we more mature? I don't think this is quite the forum to demonstrate how little harmony there is. But let's just go with the fact that if we open the newspaper, we do not see instances of harmony. We see instances of violence, cruelty, oppression, misery. And we are not living in harmony, would be. We may not be as bad as some of the banana republics, but we are getting there. We will also be one day. We can proudly claim that we are a banana republic. Maybe.
Roy Matthew's hand is still up, or is it a new question? And there is Washington saying...
No,
I'm sorry, what? Somebody said something.
Okay, whoever wants to speak. Roy, if you finished, Roy is over, then now, Washington, would you like to?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
sir,
ma'am.
I just wanted to add on the statement you just said, sir. I think it's just not upon the colonization and the colonizer that people have this attitude, like what you just said, sir. I think people usually have this attitude towards people who has oppressed them. For example, I have noticed the same thing that people are not appreciating when the oppressors treat them well. Like, for example, people from my state, when they go outside, they usually focus upon the crimes and all these petty things which they do upon us. But most of the times, we often ignore how other people help us or how other people appreciate us and our identity. So I think it is just not upon the concept of colonization. I think it also extends to the idea of oppression and the oppressed and the oppressor.
That is what we were trying to, I think, establish, both Anna and I, that you can't attribute all this to colonial legacies or colonial histories. Quite a lot of it is internal to how we have lived and how we are. Not necessarily because somebody dealt us a bad hand, but because of our own intra-ethnic, intra-tribal, inter-community battles. We have oppressed each other, and not necessarily that we have all been oppressed only by the whites. There have been internal refugees, internal migrants, internal secondary citizens in almost all cultures around the world. So it's not always just a racial divide. I think that's what we were trying to get at. But yes, I see the point you are making. Thank you, Washington. We apologize, as Anna said, if you are unable to get your first names and last names right, because we are only going with the names that flash up on the screen. So sorry if you are getting the order and sequencing wrong.
Hello, sir. Good evening. Hello, ma'am. Good evening. I'm Aditi. I'm one of the coordinators with this Junior Science Club. So I had a couple of questions to ask. They are mostly related to the Literature Nobel Prize and also how things are decided in general. So taking this year's prize in consideration, how is some literature more relevant at that particular time compared to some other literature? And how is the Nobel Prize decided? Like the committee sits and sees like what are the current issues which needs to be addressed through literature and then looks for a Nobel Prize or a person who has done work on that area? And do they look through all the books, all the cultures, and read through all the literature which is there on that topic?
The Nobel process is anyone can nominate, any faculty from any part of the world can nominate an author to the Nobel committee. The members of the jury that pick the Nobel are not a public domain. So we do not know who the jury members are and the reasons for their nomination. The only evidence we usually have is the citation for given by the prize committee to the laureate. The actual process is not available to all of us. The other part of your question, which ones are more relevant? That is, I think, what Anna was trying to contextualize, that in any period in time, certain kinds of novels make more sense to be read. But it also has something else that we should perhaps underscore. Certain kinds of novels are revived in a certain period in time. What could have been, say, a 1950s novel suddenly becomes more popular now because of what it tried to say. In the wake of nuclear disasters, for instance, novels about nuclear disaster from the 50s, for example, Neville Shute's On the Beach, were revived. Now we live in a time of climate change, and you see a revival of novelists from the 60s like J.G. Ballard, who wrote The Drowned World. It's the first novel that I'm aware of which speaks about the ocean and water levels rising and the ice caps melting. This is a 1960s novel, J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World. And already he was predicting the rise in ocean levels and the drowning of cities. And in that particular novel, all cities have drowned, including London. So, yes, they are aware of the context, but one tends to think they are interested in a whole body of work by an author, not just one novel, because the Nobel is for a lifetime as a work in a particular field. Some novels, some authors appeal. So I don't think they pick the context first and then search for an author who has done that, but it should speak to the time in many ways. Anna, would you like to add something?
Yeah, this is a discussion which we had with our MA class a couple of weeks ago as to why certain things get more traction at any given point in time. Now, though we cannot say why they get traction at a certain point in time, it's also kind of circular, isn't it? That when, say, LGBTQ is in fashion or is the hot topic of the day, then at that point, literature which is to do with LGBTQ issues will be also more prominent. It will gain more publicity. It will be out there in the public realm. So if it is, and let's not forget that all of 2020 was to do with Black Lives Matter. Now, and it still continues, so of course, much less now, and now the wind blowing in the other direction, especially in places like US. When that has so much importance, then it is bound also to be, and this you would be able to see if you were to look at sites such as the British Library. The British Library has just put up a timeline for Black literature. Similarly, other places as well, everybody is highlighting, because of the importance of the issue, they highlight text, literature, people to do with that issue. I can give you an example from my area of interest, which is Shakespeare Studies. So the Folger Library, which is the largest Shakespeare library in the world and located in US, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, through the last few months of 2020 and through into 2021, they have been interviewing academics and scholars who work with issues concerning Blacks in Shakespeare's plays, in productions of Shakespeare's plays, and in how you teach issues connected to Black Lives Matter in today's world. So you see, the dominant mood or the dominant movement might be one thing, but how academia responds to it. And in one sense, the Nobel Prizes are purely academic, are they not? How academia responds to it is what we are seeing, whether it is in the choice of a Nobel or whether it is in, like I said, the Folger Library in Washington and what they're doing with Shakespeare. Everything is to do with Black Lives Matter. We had a couple of other examples also we had heard about how social justice was the plank chosen by a literature department so that they could then highlight issues to do with social justice. So you see, those make a difference.
And Harvard is reissuing, Harvard University Press is reissuing several histories of Black resistance, Black music, and commissioning new books almost entirely in Black history and culture. They also have a Black Literature Month, a book list, which they do, which they compile and put out there for people to know. And that contains history books, cultural histories, literature, and a whole bunch of academic writings as well. So Harvard is doing it in that fashion. But yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. And well, I just wanted to ask your opinion on something which I was thinking. So, like the motto of Nobel Prizes, like the line which they write, it's written that it is meant for the greatest benefit of mankind. And being a science club, sometimes we tend to overlook how literature and how much literature is important for us. So it will be great if both of you can shower your thoughts on this.
I'll leave this tricky question to Anna. You're on mute, Anna.
Let me see if I got the question right, Aditi. If it is that the Nobel is about the greatest good, so how does literature contribute to the greatest good of mankind? Is that the question?
Yeah, not fully, but I understand how it does. But sometimes it's important for a science club to communicate this idea as well. So I would love to have your views.
Okay, all right. So you see why it's important. So what does literature do would be the question which would answer your question, Aditi, that literature helps us. Now, if you were to do your science, you sit in your laboratory or you do your work with, if you are doing astronomy, you do your work with your telescopes and the stars. And if you're doing in your physics laboratory or your life science, wherever, right, you're sitting somewhere and you're doing something, how do you then see the world which is beyond you? You might be traveling to conferences where you will meet other scientists who have been sitting in their laboratories and you will speak to them. But to meet the world which is out there, which is greater than the laboratory and which also will be impacted by everything that you do in your laboratory, where do you go to find that world? You're not going to be able to meet all of that world by stepping out of your laboratory and talking to 5 people, even if they are people from literature backgrounds. So one of the ways in which you meet the world, and you meet people other than yourself, you meet people who are different from yourself, is through literature. So then when the Nobel says that the greatest good is also via literature, because literature broadens our horizons. That's the beginning of an answer to your question, Aditi. It was a very good question. Thank you. Pramod, now you can take off from there and start.
Very smart. Yes, I will build on one point that Anna made towards the end. Literature is the place where you meet people who are not like you, people unlike us. Second, literature is also the route to imagining yourself in the place of the other, where you are able to transport yourself into the mind, the thoughts, the consciousness, the emotions, and the lives of people separated from you, whether it is 16th and 17th century England and the Renaissance, which is Anna's hunting ground, the age of Shakespeare, whether it's 19th century Victorian London, which is the age of industrialization, the arrival of steam, or contemporary Africa, as we have seen in the works of Abdulrazak Gurnah, where you meet people unlike us, and yet you build connections, saying, oh, it might be Africa that Gurnah is talking about, or it might be tribal warfare that he's talking about. And as Washington's question made clear, it is not necessarily only Africa and Africans who experience oppression in those ways, or immigrants to England who experience immigrations in certain ways. But as Washington's question pointed out, as he said, from where I come, we have a certain attitude which is closely resembling these others. Literature is what allows you to connect to things that are completely disconnected from you in other ways. It is also the basis of your empathetic and sympathetic imaginations. Oh, Anna has raised her hand. Okay, all right, Anna.
No, it's just, I wanted to say, in continuation of what you were saying, that literature is where we see the other. So there are these two ways in which you describe literature, that literature works as a mirror or literature works as a window. Literature works as both. In it, you see yourself. In it, you see what is standing outside. If you are not able to see both of these clearly, then you are lessened, diminished as a person. You should be able, ideally, and literature does that for you. Yeah.
Thank you,
that
sir.
works.
Thank you, ma'am. Those are very beautiful answers. But one more thing which I was pondering about, that mostly literature prize in Nobel Prize in Literature has been centric to English literature. Sometimes people say that, when you translate certain literature into English, it loses its authenticity, and maybe that's why they sometimes lose on it. So do you think, what do you think about this?
No, I mean, there are people from other countries whose literatures have been given the Nobel for what they have done, irrespective of the language in which it has been done. At some point, yes, I will go with what you're saying. Some things are lost in translation, but some things are also gained in translation. If these people were not available in translation, we would never know the brilliance of a Solzhenitsyn or a Chekhov. We wouldn't know the writings of the Polish, the Armenian, the Russian poets. For example, someone like Anna Akhmatova, whose poem A Requiem is about, it's something that some of you might want to do. Anna, would you type it up, please? As Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, where this woman is waiting outside the Russian prison in wintry, rainy day, on a rainy day, waiting for a glimpse of her son or brother, I forget who, is in prison. And the woman behind her, also waiting to meet her son who's in prison, asks her, what do you do? She said, I write. And she says, would you write about this? Anna Akhmatova's description of waiting on a rainy day outside a prison, and she will never see her brother or son again because he'll be tortured to death in the prison, is only available to us in translation. We would not be able to read Akhmatova in the original, like we wouldn't be able to read many of the great Italian, East European writers, including Italo Calvino and others, but for translation. So I'm not particularly fond of the argument that the Nobel goes to people who write only in English, because it hasn't been quite factual that way. But also because in many cases, the power of the writing does communicate with some losses, even in translation. Anna, would you like to add to that?
Having said all that, and having agreed with all that Pramod said so far, Aditi, I would still say one additional factor, and that is more in line with what you were saying, that it is English texts, maybe not English, but shall we say the European first world texts. Because let's not forget that the Nobel itself is governed by Sweden. It has first worlders doing the job. So it will only be texts that they are familiar with, even the nominations. It is not that all the nominations are going to come from India. Otherwise, then there would be people from here. I put up the process by which the Nobel in literature is given. So you take a look at that. They invite nominations from select people. It's not like I can also, today I can send off 3 nominations, Pramod can send off another 3, Aditi will send 2, Bhadra will send 5, Dr. Srinath will send 4. No, it doesn't work like that. So obviously, there is going to be a bias towards the first world / the Western world, all of those ones. The rest of the world will not get such a look in unless the authors are that big. However, when we think about the fact that Tagore, early 1900s, he gets the Nobel, then my argument seems to kind of fall apart until you think of the fact that Tagore had a sponsor in the white world. So it's also about that kind of traction. The global south versus the global north would be how maybe you could think about it.
Are there any more questions?
No, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, you're muted.
Yep. Okay. Tagore sponsored WBS, if I remember right.
Yes. Why is that coming up?
No, because somebody asked over there.
Oh, okay.
I'm
not watching the chat, so okay. Yeah. Yes.
So WBS.
No, he also wrote the foreword to Gitanjali.
Also, he got the Nobel. Now, think of the network that exists. It's not a network into which you and I will have purchase.
Thank goodness for that. We are not so noble.
She's such a sad pun. Anyway, never mind.
Thank you, Professor Srinath.
And thank you, Junior Science Club, for inviting us. We haven't done this before. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Whether Pramod did or not, he will now tell us. But I had a really good time. Thank you so much.
Always good to have an opportunity to talk about literature. And of course, any conversation with Anna is always lovely.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, for addressing all the questions. And if there are no more questions from the audience, we'll proceed with a vote of thanks. So on behalf of the Junior Science Club and the Entropy Club, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our honorable speakers, Professor Pramod Nayar and Professor Anna Kurian, who shared their virtual presence and took out valuable time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge with us. And I also wish to express my gratitude to the Director of the College of Integrated Studies, Professor B.V. Sharma, Associate Director Professor Salman Abdul Moez, Dean of School of Life Sciences, Professor Siddhavatam Dayananda, and the HOD of the Biochemistry Department, Professor Krishnaveni Mishra, for providing us the opportunity and the support to organize this talk. I'm very grateful to all the faculty coordinators of JSC and Entropy Club, Dr. S. Silanguvan, Dr. Archana Murli, Professor Muralidharan, Professor Srinath, Professor Sharmishta, and Dr. Manjari Kiran for their constant presence, guidance, and valuable encouragement. I also take this opportunity to extend my big thanks to our CIS and SLS office members, all the senior and fellow student coordinators of the JSC and the Entropy Club. With this, we now come to an end of the Nobelium 2.0 webinar series. We would like to thank all the speakers for the event and our dear audience for participating with such enthusiasm and patience. Thank you all very much for making this event successful with your contribution, and we hope to see you all soon with our future events. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Once again.